Hi, everybody. Unaccustomed as I am to public speaking, I've been invited to introduce our first speaker, Michael Champagne. I would just like to share a few words with you regarding Michael and his work in the community. I first met Michael in around 2011, 2012 when he had formed Aboriginal Youth Opportunities and came together with a little group of young people, not even knowing at the time that he was engaging in peace work, but they came together to end the violence in their communities and in their neighborhoods. You can look up their work, that it's become so multifaceted, and I would encourage everybody to check out their website, iomovement.com. But, my activism goes back to the 60s, and as you can see, I'm wearing my Jimi Hendrix t-shirt today because he was a very strong influence in my development and who I am today even. And back in 1966, Jimi Hendrix appeared on the Dick Cavett Show, and he made a statement that still resonates for me, and I carry it in my pocket, and I share it with everybody. Jimmy said, "When the power of love overcomes the love of power, the world will know peace." And I believe, I try to express this in my life, but more than that, I believe that Michael and his little group of young people doing the work that they do in the North End community expresses that. They bring peace wherever they go. They're also engaged in peace work. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce Michael Champagne.
Good morning, relatives. It's beautiful to see you all here today. Of course, I want to begin by acknowledging the beautiful Treaty 1 land upon which our march will be taking place today. The homeland of the Anishinaabe, Métis, Cree, Dene, and of course, a land that is rich with social justice. Treaty 1 territory and this community upon which we gather here today is a beautiful, vibrant, amazing community. And since time immemorial, Indigenous peoples of this territory have welcomed visitors from many different places to come and be a part of the circle, to welcome our relatives into the village, to welcome people into our community so that we can all work together to make our community a little bit safer and illuminate the darkness so tomorrow can be a little bit brighter. I know that a lot of what we talk about at this Peace March is about what's happening to our relatives around the world, and I want to commend all of you for that beautiful focus, because we must stand up for our relatives around the world. An injustice to one is an injustice to all. And I think that it's important for us as we gaze around the world to the different places, Palestine, Venezuela, and many other places, that we actually continue to look also at ourselves and also in our own backyards. Because as important as peace is in the world, peace means nothing if we can't walk our own talk. And right now there is a war in this country against Indigenous people, and if we really are serious about peace, we need to stand together. And I'm here today as a helper from our Indigenous community here in this city, not only to acknowledge the territory that we are on today, but also to draw that connecting line between what we see over there and what work we need to do here. There is no reason that with such influential, intelligent, capable people in the circle that I see before me today, that we can't address the epidemics that we are facing here at home. Epidemics of missing and murdered Indigenous women, epidemics of children overrepresented in child welfare, epidemics of our relatives, families, and children across this land that do not have access to basic things like clean drinking water. And yes, I am talking about our relatives in Shoal Lake 40. So we must ensure that we work as hard as we can to call attention internationally to what is happening, as well as what is happening here at home. And I want to say thank you to all of you for being here today, for standing in the circle, for being counted as helpers in this movement of peace, because we have to continue. Yes, we're in year 37, and we may need to go for 37 more years. However, I feel like we can get there if we do it together. So I want to thank all of you for the work that you do, not only today, but every day, in our communities, in your workplaces, in your neighborhoods, in your life, trying to bring that concept of peace to reality. Because without our actions to match, all this talk of peace is just empty words. And I believe in the people in this circle here today that we want more than that. And so let's let our actions match our words and do what we can to bring the peace around the world and right here at home. Thank you very much for listening to me, and thank you for being a part of this walk today. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for those very thoughtful words. And we've noted it here before that Canada can't really be called a democratic country or a country that stands for justice so long as the question of the First Nations people is not resolved, and so long as First Nations people do not become a full and equal partner in this country. And it does reflect on, it reflects internally on Canada, what Canada is as a country, and it also reflects externally and in what Canada does in terms of its foreign policy and its attitude towards other countries, the relationship it has here with its First Nations people. So as long as it's content to allow that relationship to be what it is, then Canada cannot really be considered a democratic or a just country. And I would say that it will not find its way as a country which is capable of being a force for peace in the world. So thank you very much for coming here to make this the 37th Walk for Peace possible. We are just a few minutes away from getting underway. You see around you some of the banners, Freedom for Palestine, Canada hands off Venezuela, and of course behind me, Canada must work for peace. These are just some of the issues that we're raising here today. And in some ways they reflect really how Canada is not a force for peace in the world. I mean, they're just two examples. There are more. I was interviewed on CJOB radio this morning, and the interviewer was talking about Canada as being a country as known as a peacemaker. And I pointed out that really that it's not its history. And that is what brings us here today, because our role here in carrying on this walk is to raise the issues about what Canada should be doing. And I think that's the significance of the walk. It's true during the year, as the Peace Alliance Winnipeg and others, we respond to various events going on in the world. Just a couple of months ago, we responded to the bombing of Syria by France, Britain, and the United States. But on this day, this is the day which we can focus on the other issues and not just be responding to events. And I have to say that there are very encouraging signs in the peace movement. Those of you who might remember the first walks for peace, remember that they were very large. And you might say, well, today there's a small turnout, which is true, but it's a significant turnout. It's a very good turnout in my opinion. But the important point is that the peace movement is finding its bearings, and it hasn't given up the struggle to make Canada a factor for peace in the world. And there are encouraging signs, as I was saying. For one, we have established the Prairie Peace Partnership in conjunction with the Regina Peace Council and other activists in the Saskatchewan region, and their influence extends over into Alberta. Another thing is there is a move afoot to really re-energize the peace movement nationally. And Michel Chossudovsky spoke on this at his talk in Regina a little bit, and then had a talk the next day with activists. So those are some of the things that we are discussing and as part of our work, ongoing work as the Peace Alliance Winnipeg. And I would encourage you all to join it in whatever way that you can or feel that you can contribute. We have a Facebook page, we have a website, and of course we meet on a regular basis to discuss these issues and to make plans about how we can be effective here in Winnipeg and here in Canada. So with nothing further from me, I'll just ask this banner then to get ready by putting it back on the pole. You can take it down. And we'll assemble behind this banner because this is the main banner for the march. The other banners can participate wherever they fit in. We'll head out this way. Our route is down, it's a short route, it's very easy. It's downriver to Stradbroke, Stradbroke to Osborne to Stradbroke, Stradbroke to a street called Scott, back to River, and then back here. So it's a very modest.
Planted by the water, we shall not be moved. Here's the city and country together. The city and country together, we shall not be moved. The city and country together, we shall not
The person I'd like to call on to speak is Henry Heller. Henry Heller is active with the Venezuela Peace Committee, amongst other things, and he has spoken extensively on the question of Venezuela and of Canada's various role in trying to undermine the present government in Venezuela. So without anything further from me, I'd ask Henry Heller to come up and talk.
I'd like to start actually not with Venezuela, but with Korea, and start with a story. Years ago, I was invited to a wedding reception at the Corridon Community Center, and I turned up there. It was a wedding social, and people were standing around eating veggies and kielbasa, etc. And I didn't know many people, so I started up a conversation with a guy who was likewise standing on the floor, and we chit-chatted for a while, and then he suddenly lifted his trousers, and instead of legs, he had two wooden stumps, basically, as legs. He said, how do you like my legs? And I didn't say anything, and he said, well, I was in the Korean War, and I was blown up at Kapyong, and so I said, well, why were you part of the forces at Kapyong? Why were you part of the Canadian forces there? He said, I couldn't get a job in Canada. That would have been the recession of 1949. And so he joined the forces, and he ended up with his legs blown away. I didn't say anything, but I knew the story. I knew what had happened. And what happened was he was basically serving, as were the Canadians, at the behest of the United States, doing their work, following along with the Americans. And the people who he was opposing, the North Koreans and the Chinese, they were defending their motherland and the People's Revolution in Korea and in China. That was a hidden reality. Now, if you have some questions about what I'm saying, go to YouTube. Go to a chap by the name of Bruce Cumming, spelled with one M, and you'll discover the reality of what happened in Korea and what Canada, as a subordinate of the United States, was doing. And that was the beginning of Canada's role, ostensibly peacekeeper, but really there was a division of labor. Canada did the work of the United States of America and its NATO alliance for years and years, and developed this deep war culture which we're still living in. But lo and behold, we find in this very year, suddenly, we find that the talk, instead of facing nuclear conflagration, suddenly all the talk in Korea is about peace. Why did that happen? It certainly didn't happen because of the initiatives of Donald Trump. It happened because in Korea, North and South, a great peace movement has arisen amongst the people. And basically, they said, we've had enough of the military situation, and we want an end to it. And so Trump, willy-nilly, has been forced to comply. Now, what I'm saying is that Canada today, faced with what Trump has done for reasons of expediency, is saying, no, no, no. No, we want the militarization and the system of war tension to continue in Korea. and they are actually saying the same thing all over the world. Canada stands for this permanent system of militarization and deep war tensions, and nowhere more so. I don't have that much time to develop this, but nowhere is this more true. It's true in the Middle East. It's true in the Ukraine, but nowhere is it more so than in Venezuela today. In Venezuela today, although hidden from the Canadian public, there has developed in Venezuela a great movement of ordinary people to take control of their lives from the rich people and the Americans and the Canadians who own the country. And the Venezuelans are trying to basically take back control over their country. What is Canada's position? Despite the fact that election after election has confirmed the Maduro government in power, this workers' government, a government of workers, the Canadian government, the American government, and the rich people in Venezuela are doing everything they can to destroy this government. And Canada is in the forefront of this. Canada, the CBC, the journalists, they're all complicit in this situation. What you need to do is you need to go deep into Google. You need to go deep into YouTube. And yes, you have to start reading, and you will understand the truth that lies behind my words. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Henry. I would just like to give a few short remarks about Canada's involvement in NATO. One of the themes, or I shouldn't say one of the themes, but one of the issues that was raised in the walk was the question of Canada's participation in NATO. And the question is, and I raised it this morning in the interview on CBC, on CGOB, when the interviewer asked me what are some of the factors today that make Canada a participant in war and war actions. And I raised the question of Canada's membership in NATO. And of course, in an interview, you can only touch upon things very briefly. And in a way, this synchronizes very good with the remarks Henry made, because NATO very much is about a question of a militarist culture and a war culture. And just very briefly, NATO was founded in 1949. So that's 4 years after the end of the Second World War. And by the establishment of NATO, in the establishment of NATO, you have the first step of the creation of this militarist culture at the end of the Second World War, when the whole Second World War was about the end of that through the elimination of German militarism and Japanese militarism. So just 4 years after the Second World War, you have this resurgence of militarism in the spirit of the creation of NATO in 1949. And I should point out that in 1949, up till 1949, there was every effort to make Europe a country, a continent of peace. The aims of the Soviet Union in the immediate period after the Second World War were for the demilitarization of Europe and for a common, and in order to give assurances to all the European countries that there would be no repeat of the Second World War, what happened there, that there would be mutual security in Europe, guaranteed by all the participants. The creation of NATO in 1949 signaled that all those, that possibility would end. NATO at the time it was founded had 12 founding members, and for a period of time it remained that. By the mid-1950s, NATO brought into its scope the German, at that time the West Germany. And with bringing West Germany into the NATO orbit and as a member of NATO, that sparked the escalation of the militarism within Europe. It was after that, and only after that, that the Soviet Union formed its own defensive alliance called the Warsaw Pact, along with other countries of Eastern Europe. NATO for a long period of time remained at that level, and as Henry pointed out, the Korean War was the first war in which NATO developed its military command structure. And for a period of time, NATO and the Warsaw Pact were the two main alliances which confronted each other. But nonetheless, NATO has always remained this factor for militarism and war. And it becomes very clear, this becomes very clear, especially in the period after 1989 and 1990, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the dismantlement of the Warsaw Pact. NATO immediately begins on a period of expansion into the countries that used to be part of the Warsaw Pact. It was that period that saw NATO also intervene first in the war in Bosnia, and in fact NATO was a major contributing factor for the destabilization of the Balkans in Bosnia and then Yugoslavia. So the 1990s see the wars, NATO-led wars in Bosnia and Yugoslavia. Then you have the wars in Libya. And then you have more recently NATO's adventures in Syria and other places, and in Iraq. So for us to say that NATO is one of the main dangers of war, it means that by Canada's participation in NATO, Canada is actually involved in those war preparations to various degrees. It's not well known, but NATO has increasingly changed its doctrine as well as in expanding its member states and its reach around the world. NATO currently stands at 29 member states, and if you look at any of the maps that are available in terms of how NATO has changed as a structure in the world, you see it first as a set of countries confined to Europe. And if you look through its various expansions, it is now an organization that reaches all the way from Europe through the Middle East and into Asia. Not all with direct member countries, but what it calls global partners in NATO. And in fact, at the coming NATO summit, NATO is expected to add another country to its orbit. And that is the recent changes that have happened in Macedonia. And it is expected to now have Macedonia enter into NATO at the coming summit in July. NATO also recently added as a partner nation Colombia in South America, which marks the first time that NATO has actually had any kind of role or relationship with South America. All these things taken together show the extreme danger that Canada maintains by maintaining its presence in NATO. Not only that, NATO, as I said, continuously has changed its policy of intervention. In the 2000s, NATO decided to make public various documents of its decision-making process. And those documents, in those documents you can see, because they released them publicly, that NATO's mandate has changed. NATO's mandate now also includes, it initially started in 1949 as simply an organization of mutual self-defense. That was its founding principle. There was other motivations, but that was its founding principle. Today, through various NATO summits, its doctrine of intervention has changed to the point where in the mid-2000s, NATO advanced that in defending interests of NATO countries, it could look at the question of their economic interests and their strategic interests in various regions of the world. So that brings us full circle to the question of NATO and the danger it represents to Canada, and why we say that one of the movements that should develop in Canada is the movement that Canada should remove itself from NATO in order to be a factor for peace in the world. And in terms of what we can do about that, I think it's important that we start that discussion, because of the parties that are currently in Parliament, only one party, the Green Party, is open to the question of discussing Canadian foreign policy and Canadian membership in NATO. All the other parties are of the view that the status quo in NATO is perfectly fine. So I think that one of the roles that we of the Peace Alliance and others have to do is to begin that discussion about what NATO membership means and what Canadians should do. I would guess that Canadian parliamentarians do not realize the full extent of Canada's commitments to NATO. And I don't mean just militarily or financially, those financial obligations. I mean those documents that have actually expanded the NATO mission to now include questions of securing sources of raw materials and other strategic interests that lie within the NATO sphere of influence. Those are very dangerous words, because they are the words that link Canada to the possibility of Canada becoming involved in broader conflicts. And I just want to say how those conflicts might arise. You've often heard of the doctrine of responsibility to protect, or R2P. So we see how that is very selectively applied to various struggles to engage Canada in various wars or military ventures abroad. For example, the question of Libya. Libya was an example of the right to protect. Syria, it was also raised in connection with Syria, that NATO should be involved in Syria. It never did, because the situation just didn't present itself for NATO to be involved there directly. But it was also raised around the question of Syria and the responsibility to protect. So the issue is, these are the mechanisms that will be used to inflame and create the conditions for war when and as they become necessary. And if you look, and in some ways, if you look at what is being done in terms of the demonization of Russia, there you have an example of how an enemy is being created. All kinds of allegations and assertions are made about what Russia is doing on the world scale in order to justify intervention. In fact, that is why Canadian armed forces are now playing a major role as part of their NATO commitments in the Baltic states. That is why Canada is actively assisting a very regressive regime in Ukraine in opposition to Russia. So all these factors taken together show the real danger about Canada's participation in NATO, and why there should be that movement to get Canada out of NATO, and why that movement should be taken and made known to those who represent us, whether in Parliament or elsewhere. So that is one of the discussions that in this next year I can see playing a major part of the discussions we have in the Peace Alliance Winnipeg, and I think very important discussions to work out that program and what it'll mean. Thank you. Now, before we end, we have one last speaker, and there will be an opportunity if anybody wants to add their own thoughts from coming up here and speaking. But I'll ask Bassam Hosseima to come up and speak about the question of Palestine and what is happening there, and what role Canada has in that. Bassam is active with the Peace Alliance Winnipeg and other organizations that deal with the question of Palestinian rights. Bassam?
Thanks, Glenn. Today I want to talk about Gaza, the dire situation that's going on in Gaza. Gaza was in the news a couple of weeks ago, It's a dire humanitarian disaster that's taking place there, affecting 2 million people. And the way I look at it, these 2 million people are basically imprisoned in the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip is being referred to by many humanitarian organizations, including the United Nations, as an open-air prison, the world's largest open-air prison. There's close to 2 million people in that strip of land. The Gaza Strip is 360 square kilometers. It's about 36 kilometers long and 10 kilometers wide. Winnipeg has an area of 464 square kilometers. So the population of Winnipeg is about 700,000, I think. Now imagine the population of Winnipeg more than doubling, being more than double what it is now. And imagine a heavily guarded fence around the perimeter of Winnipeg with remote control machine guns, constant drones flying overhead, monitoring every movement of every person. Imagine the guards maintaining the fence are in total control of the goods and services that, including medical supplies that come into Winnipeg, allowing only what they choose to allow. And imagine that no one is allowed to leave Winnipeg without the consent of these guards. Imagine that Winnipeg is intermittently subjected to violent military incursions and discriminately killing men, women, and children, and leaving entire neighborhoods devastated and hundreds of families without homes. If you're able to imagine that, then you can begin to get a picture of what's happening in Gaza and what's been happening there, at least for the last 11 years. Since 2007, Israel has imprisoned the entire population of the Gaza Strip and has imposed a blockade on the people living there. Israel is in complete control of the goods and services that are allowed to go into Gaza, and they choose who gets to leave and who gets to come in. Israel's control of the Gaza Strip, as one author described it, is so sophisticated that Israel counts every calorie and controls every chemical compound that enters the territory. The calculated cruelty of the blockade on the Gaza Strip can be illustrated by one example of one Israeli policy, and that is there was a statement made by Dov Weisglass. He was the advisor to the Prime Minister at the time in 2008. And he said, the idea is to put the Palestinians on a diet, but not to make them die of hunger. In 2008, health officials provided the government of Israel with calculations of the minimum number of calories needed for Gaza's inhabitants to avoid malnutrition. These figures were then translated into the number of truckloads of food that Israel was supposed to allow into the Gaza Strip each day. The Israeli health minister determined that Gazans needed an average of 2,279 calories each to avoid malnutrition. That translates into 170 truckloads of food that can be allowed into the Gaza Strip. Now, Israel's military officials, however, found a pretext to cut that number down, the number of trucks. So they would allow only about 67 trucks a day to enter the Gaza Strip. This compared to about 400 trucks of food that were going in and out of the Gaza Strip before the blockade. The people of Gaza are resilient. They're resourceful. They find ways to make sure their children don't starve because of Israel's blockade. The people of Gaza have small farms and garden plots where they grow vegetables and fruits. They have small poultry farms and dairy farms. They also rely on the sea for fish. But the vindictiveness and cruelty of Israel's occupation knows no bound. Every time the Israeli military mounts an attack on the Gaza Strip, as it did in 2014, it not only targets schools, mosques, and churches, and hospitals, they target the small subsistence farms, chicken farms and dairy farms, killing the chickens and the livestock. They also constantly harass Gaza's fishermen. Israeli attacks on the fishing boats are continuous. On a daily basis, Gaza's fishers are shot at, wounded, and killed. Targeting Gaza subsistence farms and fishing is to make sure that the prisoners of Gaza Strip don't get any more food calories than what is allotted to them by Israel's Zionist regime. What Israel is doing to the people in Gaza is a war crime. It's a crime against humanity. It's collective punishment, and collective punishment is a war crime, and it stands in violation of the Geneva Convention. The international community, including our own government here, the international governments, including our own government here in Canada, see what is happening in Gaza Strip, but they say nothing. And often they go as far as support the crimes that the Zionist government of Israel is doing. The intolerable and cruel conditions in Gaza Strip finally stirred the people on March 30th of this year, to begin to mount a nonviolent peaceful protest at the prison fence. The vast majority of the demonstrators are descendants of refugee families who lost their homes to the Zionist colonization in 1948. My grandfather and my grandmother, their sons and daughters, were one of those families that lost their homes in 1948 and who are living in the Gaza Strip right now. The demonstrators on March 30th were demanding an end to the blockade and to be allowed to return to their ancestral homes that lie just beyond the Gaza Strip border, just to the north of the Gaza Strip. As usual, the response of the prison guards, the Israeli military, was quick, ruthless, and brutal. On the first day of the demonstrations, Israeli snipers took aim at the demonstrators and killed 16 people and wounded 1,415 people. The demonstrations and Israel's cruelty and murderous response continued into June. As of June 4th, at least 110 people have been killed and around 12,000 people have been injured by the Israeli military. To excuse the massacre of innocent demonstrators, the Israeli Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman said on Israeli public radio that there are no innocent people in Gaza. This is the view that the Israeli government has of the people in Gaza, and the view that the soldiers have of the people in Gaza. Nobody is innocent there. Everyone is a target. And that's why they're able to do the kinds of things that they do to Gaza. The response by the international governments, including our own, was predictable and shameful. There was some finger wagging at Israel, but overall, the international community was parroting the Zionist line that Israel has a right to defend itself, while at the same time blaming the people who are being killed and being shot. So here we are walking for peace and calling on our government to make peace and not war. We must also call on our government to end its blanket support for one of the most warlike states in the world. We must demand our government end its support for the state of Israel and its oppressive and criminal regime. Israel must abide by international law and end its oppression and brutalization of the people of Palestine, especially the Gaza Strip. The rights of the people of Palestine must be recognized. They must be recognized and they must be honored. We, as a people of conscience, demonstrate our commitment to justice and international law and human rights by supporting boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign. The campaign is being mounted by an increasing number of people throughout the world. It's gaining recognition, it's gaining momentum, the BDS campaign. And the aim of the BDS campaign is to force Israel to comply by international law. That's basically the aim of the BDS campaign. It's being vilified in the media as being something that's more than what it is, but it's a way, it's a peaceful way, it's a grassroots way of getting Israel to pay attention to international law. The leaders of Israel, they seem to believe that Israel is above the law, above laws that are made by man, above international law, above laws of war. But we, the people, the grassroots, we need to let our government know that we don't support that. And one way that we can do that is by looking up the BDS campaign and seeing what we can do about that, and also talking to our government, our officials, if we can, here in the legislature, at Parliament, and letting them know that the Canada's support for Israel is not acceptable by the Canadian people. Thank you.
So that concludes the formal part of the walk in terms of people who we had scheduled to speak on issues. But I understand Michael, who was a participant today, would like to make a few words.
Just to follow up on Bassam's presentation, we have a few stickers here for people to take with them. And the idea is to, when you find a product in one of our retailers that was made in Israel, you have to kind of look carefully at the information on the product to see whether or not it's been made in the Palestinian occupied lands. And if it is, we would invite you to put one of these stickers on it just saying, beware, do not buy this product, and why. Okay? Thank you. BDS. What is BDS? Boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Various strategies for dealing with the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian lands. Okay?
Bonjour. Mazawa Niminang, Mishnagaj Mayangan. Yellow Wing of the Wolf Clan. All my relations are with me here. How's that? How's that? Is that better? Yeah. I introduced my name in the Anishinaabe. That's the context of what I want to talk about, that ancientness of people. We remember a long time. What you call ancient history was just not that long ago for us. We're talking about 3,000 years. I remember the Pax Romana, they called it, the Roman peace. Now we have Pax Americana, NATO. It's the same thing over and over again. Human beings have to come together and grow up. What we did was we based our system of governance on empathy. I look and I see these laws, and you can have all kinds of laws and commandments, and you don't need a drop of empathy for strict authoritarian obedience. Try empathy. That's what it's going to take. Get up, stand up. You know, divest. What is it? Divest? Boycott? That's everyone's bit and part that they can do in your heart, that's what becomes important. You have to remember, we're all going to be here a long time. You know, I keep saying that we're going to be around when this is going to be referred to as the old legislative building. You know, you can't imagine how much time is ahead of us. I mean, there's Anishinaabe, we talk about time immemorial looking behind us, and ahead of us, I see it as time unimaginable. How are we going to conduct ourselves as human beings? How did we evolve this way? You know, for tens of thousands of years, it's that empathy. We're blessed with that love and kindness to reach out and hold on to each other. You know, make sure that we're all fed, and those are basic necessities of human thriving. And you look around the world and it's all, you know, you said it before, it's starting to slowly collapse in on itself again. Get out of that cycle. Embrace empathy. Try something else for a while. It's a beautiful planet. Be ashamed if something happened to it. But that is exactly the threat that these warmongers and such, that's what they want. They want you fearful and threatened. You know, some of you know that as a younger man, I was a veteran. I served in the forces of guard, yeah. And it took me the longest time, almost my whole life, to realize that eagle, globe, and anchor. Well, that's the same Roman eagle. Pax Americana, Pax Romana, and I started realizing what is going on here. Why are they taking young men like I was? Why do they still take young men to go take other, even younger lives? That is the horror. We have to stop living in horror and fear. You know? It's time to grow up, time to evolve. One thing I learned though in the Marines, they drilled that you are the weapon. You know, kind of bravado, but it really is what's in your heart is the strength. Sure, you can carve that heart and make something really horrifying with it, but you can also have something very strong and beautiful. And that's what we all should strive for. And I'm glad you're here. Like I said, our ancient history is viewed much differently. And I look around here and I see, you know, mothers and nations build, or families build nations. And you've come so far over thousands of years, not only across migration, human migration, but we're all here right now at this point. And this, to us, is a significant point in history and also significant in geography. It can spread from here. So get up, stand up for your rights. Don't be a warmonger. Thank you.
Hi, I forgot to mention, sorry, there is a symposium that is being held here in Winnipeg on September 7th and 9th to the 9th. It's Israel, Palestine, and International Law Symposium. I have a couple of leaflets here if anybody is interested in attending. There's some international authors who will be attending, and there's Michael Link, David Matis apparently is going to be talking there, Virginia Tilley, and there's a few other people. So there's some really well-known authors who will be there at that symposium.
And if anyone would like some more food, there are samosas left. Please take some. And take some home if you like. And again, that's the Walk for Peace, 2018, the 37th. Very successful. Thank you very much. And we will see you all again next year.